Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the ItCast, and I am your host, Nika Sherrell. The ItCast is our community outreach podcast that aims to increase diversity in conversations on health and sexuality. Through this work, we are creating a world where all people feel loved, honored, and respected. Check us out this October. We have some amazing events coming up. First off, tomorrow in downtown Oakland, we are having our 10-year anniversary pop-up celebration at Zanzi at 19 Grand. It'll be from 5 to 9. Come through, enjoy some live music. We'll have a DJ. It's going to be plenty of vendors, and definitely find us in our spot and our products. Next things next, later in October, we have the Global Sexual Health and Freedom Summit. The Global Sexual Health and Freedom Summit is creating a safe space where all people feel come together to embrace humanity, diversity, and the liberation of sexual freedom and health globally. So we are really creating a powerful event. That one is all virtual. Tickets are on Eventbrite. Please check us out. Look up Global Sexual Health and Freedom Summit. And you can also send me a message or post a comment here, and we'll make sure to get you the link. Last thing, please visit us on Patreon to support the ItCast and learn more about our work at theitcast.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and let's get into the conversation. This week's topic is real talk on the history of consent. As a trigger warning, this episode does contain discussion about sexual violence, sexual assault, and violence towards children. Please be mindful to take care of your needs while tuning in. Today in the booth, we have Dajia Deloney. Dajia is a part-time law student and full-time dream chaser out of Houston. She earned her bachelor's degree for international relations with a discipline in history and American culture. Dajia, how are you doing today?
Hello, I am well, excited to be here.
Yes, oh, thank you so much for being on the show. So the first thing I want to know is tell us a little bit about yourself and why you chose to do this episode.
Yes, so as you shared, I am a part-time law student. And when I say dream chaser, that's all aspects of life. It's just the fact that I'm going to continue to move on. And it comes to just why this is important to me, why I decided to come onto this episode. And it's consent, the history of it. It comes from somewhere. And what underlies that, what is the precedent of that is agency. That's how I show up. That's how I keep it moving. That's what keeps my legs going. And so that's why I decided to, do this.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. So I did not look up the stats on this, but I've always had this assumption that consent is this very new concept. I don't feel like it was around like prior to maybe the 1970s. Like, when did we start actually legally defining rape and all these things? So I would love to get some of your perspective on that. Like, is this actually a new thing, or did I just miss something?
We know it's not new. And what makes it so interesting, in a way, it's becoming more understood. To some extent, as you grow up, you really start to understand it. When you're young, it's like, yes, no, that's consent. And so that's still what people consider as consent, even in older age. So it's definitely not new.
Got it. I mean, like, from the cultural aspect, like, I don't think we were having conversations around consent and like calling it that, at least not when I was growing up, but it's good to know. Like, you're right. Yes, no, good touches, bad touches, those things. I got that in school. So let's talk about the historical context. I know for myself, I'm looking at the Black historic experience around consent, sexuality. In some of our previous conversations, we touched on slavery and a number of things. So go ahead and give me just go ahead and just take us in. Where would you like to start?
Where would I like to start? Well, when I think about the history of consent, I think of like that, the biggest breach of it is slavery. You have no consent, no agency. as they perceive it, right? And so when you get into like them not having agency, it's getting into them not maybe having the power to do such, or to show up in the way that they want, which isn't completely true, but it's generally true. And so when I get into like the history of consent, let's just I guess start with children. That was the biggest thought in my mind when I was looking at like the history of slavery. And so let me break this down. Let me break this down.
Yeah.
Children in general are this invisible appendage to the Black family. They're just additions to what you consider the Black family, and they're minimally considered in the historical landscape of slavery. But what makes the United States slavery distinctive from many other slaveries, and their most distinctive feature is the fact that they were able to reproduce. And that particular part just makes it important as far as under what conditions is this reproduction happening, right? And so, yeah.
The peculiar institution, like where your children are born enslaved, and that whole conversation, like now babies are products.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Accumulated resources. And Black children in the US, they're this economic insurance to maintaining slavery. So after 1808, America can no longer have imports of African people. 34% of those imports were slave children. And
right,
that could be where it starts, right? And so when you're coming from, you know, a country in Africa where there's this general sense of value for the people that are there, the children, they promote their growth to some extent. And so when you kind of have I guess a bit of a more distinctive culture when you come into the American context, which is under European ideals, a lot of their principles is highlighting just accumulated resources, growth, how can they get to the next dollar, right?
right.
And so
Return on
children,
investment.
yeah, one of those resources.
Yeah. And you mentioned 1808, and like when we think about, okay, you can no longer import slaves, which is like, oh, yay, that's a step in the right direction, right? And then the flip side of that is, okay, well, now we're factory reproducing the people who are already here to fulfill the demand of slavery still existing, of this institution still existing. So, I mean, it's horrendous. One of the comments up here is, oh my God, being born into no consent, what a concept. And it's like, yeah, and it hasn't necessarily gone anywhere. Like that still happens today. Hi, got some hellos from the chat. Venom 54. So yeah, go ahead.
For sure, for sure. And so what are the sources of, you know, this reproduction, this economic insurance, and that's Black women. Wilma King kind of started with this when she, you know, discussed Black women within slavery, and her book Stolen Childhood, she kind of spoke on that, and just that there's this very unique experience that Black women bring. And so when I kind of looked into the lens of what does that look like for their adolescence, because you're children before you're an adult, right?
Right.
And so they're this source of economic insurance, and that's tying, and this is where we get into that sexuality part, is that's tying their sexuality to this productive and reproductive function within slavery. So not only are they a laborer, but they're a reproducer.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and I mean, that the fact that that's tied to sexuality in this historical context, one of the things that I've said is that as Black people, like we did not own our bodies, therefore we did not own our sexuality or our sexual agency, and that's something that we have grown into, you know, since the world has changed, since these laws have changed, we now have access to that, and it's still a process, it's still a growth process. So I think that's a very clear distinction of like where we can really see that it did not exist.
Right. And I think that that's what's kind of interesting about slavery. And this is kind of what I was touching on a little bit earlier, that people consider slaves to have no agency at all, but that's not completely true. There's been resistance. There's, been contraries to what they were supposed to do, right? And so, for example, when it comes to like slave girls, they still found agency in grooming themselves, like putting flowers in their hair, prepping themselves up to, feel beautiful in their skin, selection of their mates. But then again, it does come under that umbrella that unless their slave owner didn't validate that selection, it's not valid. And so those are sources of agency, but still something that's limited.
And what was the name of that book again? You said it was Stolen Childhood?
Mm-hmm. By Wilma King.
Wilma King.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned as we're talking about like children and slave girls and, just slave children overall, you mentioned shifting from being asexual to being sexualized. And you pointed out that that's something that happens very, very young. So I'd love for you to talk a bit more about what that transition looks like and what we mean by those terms.
For sure. When we look at slavery, and then we look at the children, right? And so children, before they were considered adult workers, they were half hand, quarter hand, not full capacity of an adult worker in the slave system. And so they had clothing that would denote that they are now adult workers. Before that, it would just be to, their functions, doing things around the house, around the field, whatever, to their capacity. So they've always been workers to the moment that they were useful and up to the moment that they were useless. That's a quote by Wilma King, I believe. So very much true, very much true. And so that clothing, it was highlighted in King. And this is something that I kind of, challenge a little bit. It was highlighted that pants for little boys was a more significant rites of passage into adult work. This adult clothing denoting that. And it's because, you are now a grown man, do different things like that. But what made it distinct from little girls was that it did, when they got this adult clothing, advertise, denote the fact that they're no longer asexual, but they're now sexual. And so what was that like rites of passage looking like? And for men, or for boys, their maturation was measured based off of their heights, while the maturation for little girls was measured based off of their menstrual cycle. That happening as early as 12, right?
Right. Wow. You said rites of passage, and that cut me right to my heart. Like, when we look at terms like that, it's often like, oh, I'm looking forward to, being an adult and having this freedom. And and there's so many different rites of passage ceremonies from every different culture, quinceañeras, bat mitzvahs, like all these different things. And then you look at this, like this instance of a rite of passage and how, I'm just going to say psychologically fucked that is. Like,
exactly.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And it's kind of interesting because boys were excited to do this. It's definitely, that's what they say, right, in the book.
I think that everybody's a little excited about a rite of passage. That's why it's so messed up. Because
it's their vulnerability that, like, just as children, their immaturity makes them even more vulnerable in this particular situation. Because it was the same for girls. Like, they're excited to now be able to mate and create marriages and whatnot with others. Like, it's excitement to be desired by someone, by a male. And so that, not exactly knowing what they're into, but they're in it already.
Right. Yeah. So we're talking about young boys, young girls. Mm-hmm. One of the things, and I don't know how much you want to talk on this, but looking at the sexual trauma, like we talk about what women went through during slavery. I think that comes up a lot. We see it a lot in the media, but I don't know if that we talk about the sexual trauma that men went through. And I think that's something that's very important to like look at as we look at the way that our culture is developed now. Would you like to speak to any of that?
I definitely see how this toll went both ways, right? They would set up these quasi-marriage relationships with 6 foot men, older usually, twice the age of these pubescent little girls, right? And just having to do that, having to reproduce with a little girl, but this doesn't stop at just little girls. I mean, mothers are still able to reproduce, right? And so, I mean, I don't quote me on this, but it definitely just that tie, the term motherfucker, where did it come from? Where did it come from? It's that forcing, the forcing of having to rape, be a vessel to a system that they, have no control over, but still causing harm to, who they're supposed to protect, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and there's a lot of psychological trauma that goes into that. Like, yes, slave men were forced to have sex with their mothers to reproduce. Studying was a real thing. And one of the things that I look at often is like Black people were compared to animals, therefore their agency didn't matter, they were property, a number of things. One of the things that I always look at, and this this may or may not be factual, so people out in the world feel free to correct me, but looking at ideas of homophobia in the Black community. I actually heard someone share about how in the islands, wealthy people would go there and they would kidnap young boys and they would rape them. And there was this fear that came about of like, anyone who is homosexual is also a pedophile. And that was not, like, that's not okay inside of the Black community. Like, homosexuality is synonymous with that. And I think that that's very damaging to people who are in the LGBTQ community, because that's not an accurate assessment. And I think it's one of those things where I look at like the history of what we've been through, and I'm like, I get that. I get that. Even though it's not fair, there's like two sides to every coin.
It truly is. I mean, I always am looking at how this stuff is systematic. This is social conditioning. Like, even myself, young, thinking that, oh, I mean, if she likes girls, then she might like me. I should be concerned about that in some way. But I mean, that's conditioning when I'm young, right?
That's real. And like, it's indoctrination, and I see it like it came through the church for me, but like the Bible came through slavery, used to like there's all these different things that led to why I have the culture I have and why I believe what I believe. But I got that exact same thing. One of my best friends was like, we can't be friends anymore. Like, you like girls, this is not cool. And it sucks. It's
it makes the conversation a dual one though. So how can the fear of like those kind of instances, the things that come behind, what underlies homophobia, right? How can those be valid while not being an attack to homosexual people, beings, right? How can those be two separate conversations? Because it is trivialized instances of violence, like drop the soap. Someone has laughed about that before.
Right. I mean, and the messed up part is, as a kid, I'm like, oh yeah, tee hee hee. And they talk about sagging, they talk about all these different things. But when you actually look at the reality of it, we're making light of something that's actually quite violent and quite, I mean, in my opinion, horrendous, but like that, yeah.
I mean, we can, recognize the lack of agency in slavery because it was just black and white, they didn't have control over whatever. But I mean, this is modern day, right? The criminal justice system, the war on drugs, the mass incarceration, just being incarcerated, that is another beast because it's right in your face in a way. This is right in town, slavery happening.
Right.
No voice.
No, you're absolutely right. And like, you know, the prison industrial complex is what arose after slavery ended. And it's not as specifically, definitively based on race, but when you look at the numbers of the population of who's in prison and what's going on, it's still a very like race-based system. And it is slavery, 100%. I mean, and slavery didn't go anywhere. It didn't. Like we have the institutions, and we also still have human trafficking. Like,
yeah, for sure. I mean, the 13th on Netflix, the movie, it breaks it down, this 13th Amendment. I mean, it was the abolition of slavery, except if you commit a crime. What is a crime? How do we define that? How do we define criminals? It's a legacy for sure.
100%. I love that you said, how do we define crime? Like that's something that we're still talking about to this day. And, you know, like it can be a crime to be someone of color specifically. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, these systems haven't changed and it is systemic. I want to look a little bit more, like I kind of touched on religion. And I always like to touch on religion and spirituality just a little bit. But so looking at this idea, you talked about like, spiritual trauma and the different things that you go through in your childhood and how that impacts us as we grow up. So would you like to share anything on that?
Yeah, so spiritual trauma to me is literally, it's pretty much this attack to your intuition, which you kind of know to be true. And so as a child, that looks like demanding to be, you know, your child's higher power. It's demanding perfection, not respecting them, over controlling, ignoring, they're above the rules, in a way referring to parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm just thinking about like, yeah, it's kind of the spiritual trauma being Black too, right? And it's more of you're told your whole life that you're this kind of way. And I'm thinking about different ways that Black people create agency despite what comes with walking while Black, right? And that's agency in your hair. That's agency in, you know, grooming yourself, whatever it may be, right? Culture. And so when I was young, it looked like I had, you know, toxicity is a thing, right? And it definitely came and touched on me a little bit. So, you know, I'm just thinking of quotes like, if you don't do as I say the way that I say it, then you're against me, that you know, are not, you're not worth, it's undermining your decisions. It's discrediting your accomplishments. It's taking ownership of those. And that's what it looked like. It gave me a not trusting of myself, not trusting in how to do things. I was always a kid that asked why. And so that got me in trouble sometimes. And that's what spiritual trauma is, not being able to ask why, not being able to know the reasoning behind the things that you do, but in trouble or upset for doing something outside of that logical, you know, thread.
The way we shut children down, like children should be seen and not heard, which I got a lot. Well, maybe, yeah, anyway. And that whole thing where it's just like, oh, someone posted being told you're bad.
Right.
Like that's a shock to the soul. Like to be inherently bad, not good, evil, to be told these things. I think that's huge. You said toxicity, like you've been touched by toxicity. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean?
You know, referring to just that I feel the bitter taste, but I'm trying to put words to it. I guess it's just, how do you describe toxicity? It's you against me. It's not being able to allow people to come in and be them. It's kind of, it's your world or no world. And if it's not in your terms, then it's not valid. So poison to the soul, yeah.
Yeah, it's that like, what I'm hearing is like that internal, like that anger, or that like, I'm right, they're wrong. I'm gonna hold on to this even though it hurts me. Like situation. Like I even feel it in my competitiveness. I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be trying to compete with everybody. Like,
right. I mean, we all got our toxic traits, right?
right.
We do. And this comes from trauma, right? This comes from spiritual trauma, comes from intellectual, emotional. I mean, we can get into all the different traumas. So it's this way of protecting yourself, that toxicity.
Yeah, that's why I wanted you to share a little bit more about it, because I think we're familiar with certain terms, like they talk about toxic masculinity, which is such a buzz phrase. And I'm like, there's more to toxicity than even gender, and like gender toxicity is a real thing. But I love that, like, we're just phrasing it like that thing inside of us. We all have a little bit of it. So knowing where it is.
Definitely. And that's why I mentioned agency. I just wanted to add, that's why, I mean, agency underlies all this, but agency in yourself to know and recognize and have compassion for the different characteristics about yourself. And so when it comes to, engaging with people that are toxic or family members, toxicity, there's this level of compassion that can be faced with that, that this person is coming from a place of hurt. And it's not about me always what someone else is projecting. And it's kind of giving someone that sense of, compassion and responsibility for the agency that they actually are, pursuing.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and I think you said this, like, we must have agency to get the consent and option. Like, if we don't have agency, we can't give consent. Like, that's just outright. Did we talk about intimacy disorders?
We didn't.
Can we?
Yes, but you just dropped a little quote there though, because for sure, like agency underlies consent, and it's that yes or no. But if your whole life has been discrediting your, decision making, you don't trust yourself. Is it yes? Am I saying this because I have to, or because I feel like this sense of maybe your feelings aren't valid, maybe what you're deciding isn't.
Thank you for reeling us back and for really elaborating on that, because, there is this yes means yes and no means no conversation that we're in. And I think that's why I look at consent being in its infancy. Like there are gray areas, like silence is not consent. Like if someone is withdrawn or avoidant, like to really be able to understand where boundaries are, I think is a big thing. And like you said, without agency, sometimes people don't know. Like I've said yes to things and I'm like, maybe not. I've said no to things and I'm like, why did I say no? Damn it. So it's still this very tricky thing. And I don't think it's as hard and fast as people like make it out to be. I think that there's something about learning and knowing yourself and having agency to be able to interact and engage with other people in a way that's healthy for you.
Very much so with knowing yourself. Like you said, you can enforce these boundaries and therefore, pursue that agency in whatever it looks like for you. But especially when it comes to sexuality, sexual conversation, situations, it's a big gray area for sure. I mean, when you're young, when do you really learn truly about like what those gray areas mean for you and the extent to which you would do? I mean, it's either you do it or you don't do it. And so when do you actually learn what those boundaries, what those healthy boundaries look like when you're growing up in those situations?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, knowing what's right for you, knowing where your limits are. So I think, so intimacy disorders. I don't know why I want to talk about this because I actually, when I think about that phrase, I'm like, that it's not like the same as sexual dysfunction. I'm like, what is an intimacy disorder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recommend this podcast. It's called Black Girls Heal. And that's when I really started to learn. And I'm like listening to this person talk about me and the way that I'm showing up in intimacy. And she put it in these different categories of love avoidance, love addicted, love anorexia. And I wish I could define all of these. But what I can say though, as far as my, my time with these, different terms, and it's definitely something you should look and experience for yourself. But with love avoidance, it's versus love addiction. So love addiction, the way that it looks, at least for me, is it's that chasing. It's feeling like I have to make it work for this person. And to some extent, it's aligned with that scarcity mindset. But also, that I have to give my all. I have to not have boundaries with this person because I don't have boundaries with myself. And avoidance is, it's either I let you in or I don't let you in. And I feel like if I let you in, I might not be able to enforce boundaries the way that makes me feel safe. So I'm going to keep you at arm's length. Usually these are working together. They could be all, at the same time. And anorexia is just this mix of, it really depends on what situation you're in.
Wow. Natty Dread, hey. This is valid for the Afro-Indigenous community as well, tying to their cultural identity. Yeah, that's real. Big love on that one. Wow, you just laid it out. I'm like, why'd I run into that fire? Definitely feel like seen and heard in that one. And yeah, I had no idea what an intimacy disorder was, but I feel it. I'm like, okay, how do I not be love addicted or love avoidant? And really looking at what consent looks like inside of relationship. Because that's a very different arena when you are engaging with someone and you don't know where you end and where they begin and what the boundaries are and how to interact and engage with that, how to not, and I'm just gonna throw the word out, not being codependent. Like, codependency is a very easy way to not have boundaries and to not be able to enforce consent.
Exactly. I mean, I think about my personal relationship with my mom. There's this interlocked value with Black women and their daughters, right? I mean, you have this historical legacy of rape, but when you come to being like the eldest daughter, shout out to my eldest daughters out there, where, my mom was this amazing woman, she is, and hard worker. And as the oldest daughter, I just wanted to make sure that things were comfortable for her because I knew that she was doing everything in her capacity for us. She would put herself in front of the fire before us and for us, right? And so just that like lack of boundary in itself was something that was displayed to me every day as this is the way love is. And I was having a conversation about someone on how that unconditional love looks different when it comes to family, when it comes to blood versus others. Nevertheless, boundaries necessary, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and one of the things that I heard is most important things I heard was about the inner resource and how you can't take care of anyone else if you can't take care of yourself. Like you don't have anything left to be able to give out. And just being real, like I have definitely given to the point of my detriment. Like I'm not even going to say given too much because like it's all love there. These people are amazing. It has nothing to do with them. But like not knowing where my boundaries are for where I need to stop and recharge and rest and take in what's there for me. Um yeah, it's like we could push past our own boundaries and not pay any attention.
Very true. And this isn't a linear process too. And I say this, for myself because I'm on this journey, but for everyone, just as far as like getting through these different, intimacy disorders where you're avoidant sometimes where you feel like you may are starting to lose yourself or, times where you notice that you're, giving more to fulfill for someone's like, incompetency or, they're not filling the cup that you're trying to fill. And so like in situations like just these disorders, it's not a linear process, it's not a linear journey. And it's something with grace and with compassion, but over time, you're gonna see it more. And that's the goal.
Yeah, I agree. Like for me, I'm hearing like, yeah, like I'll be addicted when I'm in a relationship, and when I'm not in a relationship, I'm like avoiding relationships. Like don't look at me. And it's it's not linear. It's almost like depending on the day. Um
Very much too. And you know what? I do want to I haven't taken this program, but it's a quote that she says, Tora Sense. And she really talks about like high connection, low attachment. And this is just my perception of what this is, right? It's more, I mean, I think that that's kind of what these intimacy disorders breed, like this attachment disorder, this attachment style. I'm holding on to this person until my last leg.
right.
And when you get into dating, it's this certain way of being. And I mean, you can probably speak to this a little bit more as far as when it comes to religion and the way that dating happens in, I mean, religions. I'm more thinking on the Christian perspective, at least how I see that. But marriage is prioritized, sexuality is hindered, or I mean, I don't know if that's the word, but
I'm like, yeah, like I'm demoralized. Like there's something about where it's like sexual, like marriage is the epitome of all the good things you can do. Don't have sex, don't talk about sex. Sex is not even a thing until you're married. And then when you're married, all of a sudden you're supposed to be everything for your husband or everything for your wife. Like just click, done, boom, you know all the stuff. And not even just knowing all the stuff, but like expecting that that other person's going to fulfill all of your needs or know how, or even knowing what your needs are. I think that that's really big. And sexuality, like there's a want for it to be very downplayed inside of Christianity. And I think that there are some dangers, like when you only teach about sex from a don't do it, abstinence perspective or a fear perspective, or a shaming perspective, then that takes away something that's so central to our humanity. Like we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for reproduction. So why are we perpetuating so much shame around it, so much fear or guilt? I do think on the one hand, there is the aspect of sexual safety by not like going out and having a bunch of partners. But I also don't think that I don't think that sexual shaming for like who you've been with, how you've chosen to live your life is okay. So again, two sides to that coin.
there definitely is. And you hit it on just like shame, expectations, wanting someone to kind of give you all that you need. And it's kind of interesting, especially when this goes into sex and sexual, circumstances, especially those gray areas. Like, how can this guy say, or partner, right, know what I want sexually, and I myself don't know. And so this has created some anxiety to the point where I now have to leave this place and put on a mask and perform for the rest of this, sexual instance. That right there, that muddles, what consent looks like, because are you even present?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's one of the things that came up for me is it's like, if your partner is zoned out, like if they don't care to be there, that's something else you should consider when it comes to consent. Like, it doesn't have to be this knockdown, drag out like thing. Like, it could just be like, just straight up, just, what's the word I'm looking for? Dissociation. It could be just straight up dissociation. And that's something that people don't look at or talk about when we're looking at like consent, and are things consensual? Is this something that both parties are willing, agreeing, and happy to be engaged in? And that's whether it's sexual or not. So I love that you said that. Like, it does taint the experience of consent when you're performing, when you're acting, when you're doing something to please someone that doesn't actually connect with what you need or connect with them at all. Ooh, intimacy.
Because like, where are we learning about sex? It's, porn, it's movies, the couple conversations you had. And so that's all you can perform and you can act and try and, replicate that experience. And that's why I was, really speaking on this high connection, low attachment, was because these expectations is what's being attached to. I can check off your whole list, but you still haven't quite connected with me. And you haven't quite found where is our point of connection. And this is me speaking out, but I've seen it happen to me. I've done it to others on that. And when you're kind of operating in that, like, just attaching yourself to expectations or just the things that they check off your list, it really takes away from being able to even, notice certain things like that. Not even noticing that, because you're attached, you're not connected, you're not able to receive the energy and associate what this looks like with this person and what this doesn't seem to be okay. Like, as far as consent, it disassociates from how you understand.
Yeah, how you understand. How you even understand to be able to build into that. Like what I'm hearing is, if I think that this is what consent's supposed to look like, and I've been doing this and practicing this for so long, and then it, like, something else comes in to shift my paradigm, it's like there's no way to step out of it. There's
I wouldn't say there's no way. There's hope. We got hope. We got education. This conversation here, right?
You're right. You're right. You're right.
But how, right? When we got this spiritual trauma and it's taking us away from, us trusting ourselves and knowing that there is another way, and you can critically think that your way. You don't have to be given a rubric or outline on how this is supposed to go, but you can kind of take this from within and learn that and find that.
Absolutely. That willingness to look. Yeah. This is incredible. So you dropped some gold on us earlier with stolen children. Do you have any other resources or things that you would like to share? I know there's gold in there.
As far as resources that I'd like to recommend, I would recommend, for one, to look up like a body scan meditation video, guided. And to be honest, that's really like a big point of contact as far as like getting into your body, finding agency within yourself, is to be able to experience yourself in the body in the present moment. Practicing mindfulness. These are two concepts. The body scan and mindfulness are general resources that I just give. But, you know, I'm reading different books. I'm reading different books, and I haven't completely finished all the books that I have read. But in addition to Stolen Childhood by Wilma King, I would also always recommend, you know, the Michelle Alexander. Oh, this is bad. I actually kind of forgot the name of this, but she discussed war on drugs in this book. So look up a Michelle Alexander book and get that book, because she really dives into the war on drugs. And, you know, this is just historical legacy on what that looks like, the criminal justice system and everything, as far as culture. So those are my recommendations as of now. And I mean, I did mention Sheena Tubbs, Black Girls Heal, the podcast. Yes. She also has a program, The New Jim Crow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So Black Girls Heal, Sheena Tubbs, she also has a program, the Recovery School, which kind of helps you go through those intimacy disorders. It's centered for Black women. In addition, I did mention Tora Sense. I haven't taken this program, but what I'm hearing as far as her mission is that she really kind of brings you into your body, your presence, as far as dating for women of faith towards marriage. And I haven't taken the program, but I listened to her on Clubhouse, and so she's on there as well. And she just spits gold. It's really the underlying values for me, and that if anything, take that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. Very well-rounded mix of resources. I love the intimacy conversation, and you know, just being open to love, to dating, and to do it in a way that's safe for the soul. Like, oh. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, LaDasia. And thank you everyone else out there for joining us. This is the ItCast, our community outreach podcast that aims to increase diversity in conversations on health and sexuality. Through this work, we're creating a world where all people feel loved, honored, and respected. Please join us tomorrow for our pop-up in downtown Oakland. It is our 10-year anniversary celebration at 19 Grand Zanzi, 19th and Broadway. Please come check us out. Also, later this October, we are having the Global Sexual Health and Freedom Summit. We're creating a safe space where all people come together to embrace humanity, diversity, and the liberation of sexuality for all. Tickets are on Eventbrite, and definitely we'll get that link posted into the comments. Last, visit us on Patreon to support the ItCast and learn more about our work at theitcast.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and thank you so much. We will see you here next week.